Conviction rates for rape are the lowest of any crime in Scotland. Only half of the cases which end up in court result in a guilty verdict. That's compared to 91% across all other crimes.
Our worry is that juries sometimes in these cases are making decisions not based on the evidence, but based on false assumptions.
When the story first broke about my attack, I had read all the comments about people calling me just a stupid drunk girl, like why would I go down to the park in the first place in the middle of the night?
The Scottish Government believes judge-only rape trials may be the way forward, but lawyers strongly disagree.
Why it is so many cases do not get to the stage of a prosecution before you can even consider the question of convictions. To me, we need to look at that part, because that's actually where the biggest discrepancy lies.
It's been 7 years since Katie Johnson was attacked. She was 21 and had just enjoyed a night out with friends in Aberdeen. It was the middle of winter, and before ending her night, Katie decided to grab something to eat.
I went a walk back into the city centre, and I walked past Union Terrace Gardens, and I saw it was all lit up in the bottom with park benches, and I had to text my flatmate back because she was wondering where I had been. So I decided I would just go down there, sit on the park bench and reply to her message. And it had only been 10 or 20 seconds for me sitting on that bench and opening my phone, taking my gloves off to text back, and a man ran up behind me and grabbed me by the neck and dragged me into the bushes.
Once she regained consciousness, Katie ran straight to the nearest police station.
There's a few moments where I felt like they just thought I was just some drunk girl. Like, I was in hysterics when I first came in.
They found forensic evidence and evidence at the scene. Did you feel like that was when things kind of changed in terms of you having to prove what had happened?
Yeah, definitely. So they found like my glove and my phone that was smashed, and I think they found like a piece of my underwear as well. So like that's when they started to feel like, oh, she's telling the truth.
A year and a half later, Katie's rapist was arrested.
Up until they arrested the man, it was kind of nerve-wracking every single day. I didn't know if he was like walking down the street next to me. Because he attacked me from behind and it was the middle of the night, I didn't know what he looked like. So I could have been serving him at work, I just wouldn't know.
After that, she had to wait another 6 months before the case was heard in court.
What was it like for you in court when you were giving evidence, when you were being questioned, particularly by defence solicitors?
They would just repeat like stuff over and over again just to try and get their narrative through.
Katie worried jurors wouldn't believe her because she was drunk on the night of the attack.
Any slight change in like body language, or if like one of them raised their eyebrows, I'd think, oh no, something that I've said is wrong, or they're going to perceive me differently. When the story first broke about my attack, I had read all the comments about people calling me just a stupid drunk girl, like why would I go down to the park in the first place in the middle of the night? And I thought some members of the jury might hold them thoughts as well and just come in with a preconceived notion that I am just a drunk girl that made a mistake.
Most cases never even make it as far as court, but Katie's was one of the few to end in a conviction, and her rapist was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Despite the outcome, she's backing a rethink of the way rape cases are handled. The Scottish Government recently published the Victims, Witnesses and Justice Reform Bill. Among its aims, it looks to increase support for survivors of sexual assault and improve their experience of the justice system. One of the suggestions is for a radical pilot scheme which would see rape and attempted rape cases conducted without a jury. Those with a single complainer right across Scotland would instead be heard by one judge or sheriff.
How do you think you would have felt if you had known you were going into the court just to give your evidence in front of a judge who's trained in these matters, who knows all the complexities? Do you think that would have changed how you'd felt at that time?
Yeah, I think I would have felt less stressed. Like, so it would just be me going and telling my story to a judge It wouldn't be me telling my story to 15 random strangers, and it was almost like going to the police all over again and trying to prove my story.
The proposed changes follow a review by one of Scotland's most senior judges, Lady Dorian, which raised concerns that juries in rape trials may be influenced by false beliefs about what the crime looks like. A study of mock jurors found some believed a victim should fight back, shout for help, or report what happened straight away. Where that wasn't the case, they were often less likely to convict.
If someone was stabbed, you wouldn't expect the public to say, like, what was the victim wearing when they were stabbed. Luckily, I was wearing my winter clothes, so they couldn't play the whole, oh, what was she wearing?
We have seen acquittals, particularly not proven verdicts, in cases that it seems absolutely inexplicable in the face of evidence, so cases where there's significant physical injury and still the jury simply will not convict.
Rape Crisis Scotland, a survivor support charity, says often victims try to suppress their emotions in court, but this can lead jurors to think because they aren't upset, they may not be telling the truth.
How can you be sure that judges wouldn't be prone to making those same assumptions if they were to be the only ones hearing a case?
I think the benefit of judges is that it's one small group of people that you can look at doing education work with. You can look at providing information about rape myths, and certainly research seems to suggest that the best way to deal with false assumptions around rape is to be looking at participatory education work, which is impossible to do with juries. Like you're really talking about the entire Scottish population. Whereas with judges, you've got a small pool of people that you can at least look at doing work around possible assumptions.
It's hoped the pilot will reduce the chance of those beliefs influencing verdicts. But not everyone thinks the change is the right way forward.
I think the vast majority of solicitors, particularly those obviously practising in the criminal defence sector, would say that they have considerable doubts about the studies which have been done. I don't think we are convinced about the evidence. I think it is accepted, even the Scottish Government has admitted that international evidence is limited.
And the third is to enable a time-limited pilot of single-judge trials.
Holyrood's Criminal Justice Committee, which is scrutinising the bill, asked the Law Society to have it say it isn't convinced the pilots will be effective.
We still have a substantial amount of male judges, and on one level, whilst it is argued, of course, that judges are trained in such a way that they would not be influenced in that, but surely it's arguable the other way that any judge will have come with their own thoughts and thinking.
What we do know as a fact is that convictions for rape in Scotland do fall far below convictions across all other crimes. Is that not in itself an indication that something is going wrong with the legal system there?
I think it can be said that there's something that needs to be looked at. Whether this is the solution is my question. There is also a discrepancy between the amount of convictions, even from those cases that go to court. But I think for me, I would be looking, amongst other things, at why it is that there are such a number of reported sexual offences, but that only a tiny proportion of those actually end up before the courts. And none of that will be fixed by the introduction of a pilot.
Police received 2,298 reports of rapes and attempted rapes in 2020 to 21. Just 152 of those ended up in court. Many lawyers across Scotland now say they'll boycott the single judge scheme over fears it'll undermine the justice system.
There are not enough criminal defence lawyers around, so if a significant number chose to go down that boycott route, then it's hard to see that it wouldn't have a significant impact on the system. But quite how that would work, I think, will depend on the detail as that comes out over the course of the next few months.
The pilot isn't expected to happen until the end of next year. In the meantime, the Scottish Government's still collecting evidence on how it may or may not work. But one thing there is agreement on, the whole handling of rape cases needs to be improved.
How do you feel as a person now, having gone through this, having come out the other side? Do you think it's changed you at all?
Definitely. I'd say like the first couple of years after the attack, I wasn't myself at all. I had turned to like alcohol. I was just kind of a mess, really. But it takes time to like come through something major like that. I seeked help and I actually wanted to help, and I'm doing much better for it now.
And if you've been affected by sexual violence, support and advice can be provided by Rape Crisis Scotland. You can contact them by phone, email, web chat and text. Well, the Scottish Government's plan to pilot judge-only trials is being led by Justice Secretary Angela Constance. She sat down with Selena to explain her thinking.
What we know is that we have legitimate and pressing cause for inquiry, and the pilot isn't to preempt any decision making, but it is a real opportunity to evaluate in a real world sense the impact of changing the decision maker from juries to judge in some of the most complex, difficult and serious cases. And we know from the substantial evidence in Scotland and abroad that juries are influenced by rape myths, and therefore they are not solely influenced by the evidence and matters of law, and that is cause for concern.
We've been speaking to the Law Society and they've said they're not entirely convinced by the research that's been done into this so far that it would actually be effective. And they've pointed to the very, very low number of cases which are reported which actually make it to court in the first place. Is that not a bigger problem in itself?
So we now have specialist police officers who investigate those more complex, sensitive sexual offences cases. There are now specialist prosecutors who lead on these cases in court. And of course, I think it is sensible and prudent to think about within the court process how we can have other arrangements that reduce the risk of complainers being re-traumatised, because people come into contact with the justice system quite often because of a really traumatic, disturbing experience, a crime of significant magnitude. And the last thing that we want is a court process that adds hurt upon hurt and adds trauma upon trauma. And I think there is always more scope for more data, and it is imperative that we, lift the lid on people's experiences, but also lift the lid on the data.
If you're saying that juries can't be trusted, perhaps, to make an entirely objective decision in a rape trial, what qualifies them to hear other extremely serious criminal cases, such as murder cases?
So what I'm actually saying is we can't ignore the evidence. I'm not passing judgment or comment on juries per se, but we can't ignore the evidence that tells us that juries are influenced by rape myths, because I think that would be unethical and entirely wrong for us to ignore the evidence.
It's been acknowledged that providing more education, perhaps, for jurors on these rape myths perhaps wouldn't be the most effective way to really address deep-seated prejudices that people may have. If that's the case with jurors, why is that any different with a judge?
What we know about juries is that the diversity of juries doesn't compensate and doesn't overcome the influence of rape myths. The issue with judges is that you have a smaller, easily identifiable group of professional decision makers who can, of course, participate in further training and further opportunities.
Justice Secretary, thank you for speaking to Scotland Tonight.
Thank you.